very interesting lecture, the IPF lecture by the one and only Martin Wolf. And the topic is also very exciting. It's India's role in the new world disorder. So I think this is a very important point, and I think Martin is going to, in his inimitable way, tell us both about the new world disorder and India's role in it. I don't think you need much of introduction to Martin. He's the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times. You know, in the world at different times we have peak something, right? We have peak oil, we have peak, television for the last 10 years. Now we have peak columnists because there is so much of potential for columnists that they become very prolific, and Martin is one of them. And I think every morning I wake up in the FT and there's a new column by Martin, so I don't know how he does it. So I think...
it may feel like that, but it isn't true.
What's that?
I don't write one every day, thank goodness.
No, it looks like that. It looks like that. And of course, FT is the home of many great columnists, just like the Wall Street Journal has Sadanand and many others here. So, but I think the point is that what we're going to do now is Martin is going to walk us through this. He will take about 20, 25 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. I told him to take his time because he has a lot to say. And then we'll open it up for a very freewheeling discussion. So, Martin, over to you.
Do you mind if I take my jacket?
You can do whatever you want.
So, before I start explaining what I'm going to talk about, I should give you the history of this lecture because it's important to explain why it is what it is, which is I was happily planning to come here for a peaceful period in which I would give this little speech on trade policy and listen. And then about a week ago, there was a call from Nandan asking me for reasons I have no idea, that's his problem, to give a lecture, this lecture, which I think is a lecture I've given last year. And my immediate response was, this is crazy, do I want to write a lecture? And my following response was, of course I'm going to say yes to Nandan. And one reason is I really do like the sound of my own voice, which is a great sin, but slightly less so in a columnist. And the second and more important point, and I suddenly realized this, that one has a personal relationship with the country. I've known and been interested in, involved in India since 1973. I became the World Bank's senior divisional economist. And I can say without any doubt in my own mind, I don't know whether anyone else will agree, and I hope this doesn't give any offense, but after the death of my dear friend and admired friend Manmohan Singh, I regard Nandan Nilekani as the greatest living Indian. And the contributions he's made are extraordinary, in my view. And so, of course, I said yes. But nonetheless, I would insist that the product is entirely his fault. Now, I don't really have a response to, and this is not a response to what was said in the panel, which I think was completely sensible, balanced, reasonable, the sort of thing I would do if I were asked something like that. But I have a sense, and this is gut instinct more than anything else, but it's what I tried to convey earlier the afternoon, that we are in the process of a really extraordinary global transformation. And it's happening quite suddenly, though we've been seeing the precursors of it. It's not unique to the US, though it's, of course, very important there. It is about a number of changes coming together, some of which I will touch here and some of which are too big. Many of them were discussed at length, are discussed in length in my book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, which was published a couple of years ago, and I'm now going to do an update for what's happened since. It's to do with the profound changes in global relative power, the rise, the decline of the West, The reference, of course, to Spengler is deliberate. The rise of Asia, above all India and China, profound technological changes, and profound problems in the functioning of liberal democracies and the global order which they created in the post-war period. And my instinct is these things coming together are not a small blip in history, they're transformative. And transformative on a scale that we living through them cannot really judge or feel. And you have to have a sense, at least, that a whole international order and structure of power and institutions and relationships are in the process of being transformed. So what we assume about the way the world has worked is no longer correct. How that will change it, I don't know. Who will play the larger role in the future? We discussed this already, I'll come to that later. But I think this is the starting point I have at the moment. And that is linked to my sense, of course there are many other factors, that the arrival of Donald Trump as president for a second time, after his, though I already felt this with his first, is a transformative moment for the United States. And because of the role of the United States in the world since the 1930s, it's bound to be a transformative moment for the world. So that's my starting point. So what I'm going to touch upon very quickly in this lecture, which I've obviously put together quickly in response to this request, building on and linked with what I said earlier, is the following 7 points. And I apologize, of course, these are big stories, so I'm going to jump through them, but I hope we'll have a good discussion, and I hope above all that it will stimulate thought in some of you, not agreement that I don't expect or want. I don't want you to think about what this means, and I particularly want to do it here because I think India has got to the point in its history, it's not there yet, but it's getting there, at which greatness, in Shakespeare's famous line, is going to be thrust upon you. You're going to have to start thinking about the world in which you live. And I want you to think about it in the right way because I have more hope for India right now than most other countries. I hope I'm right. So I'm going to talk about Donald Trump's second coming. I'm going to talk about his revolutionary project, or more precisely, the revolutionary project of which he is the center and above all totemic figure. I'm going to talk about possible economic consequences of Trump too, in which I will not so much disagree with what's said earlier, but put it in a broader context. I will ask whether this form of politics, which we're seeing, which authoritarian, what I think of, using a term from political science, as plebiscitary dictatorship, is a fundamentally new, sort of is now becoming a characteristic feature of the democratic order worldwide, and in my view it is. I don't think I should have to explain that here. I will talk about the other sources of global disorder, I'll touch upon them, and then I will talk, not as length as I would have liked, about some of the opportunities and challenges for India, in which I'll basically underline some of the points I made earlier, and there'll be a brief conclusion. So the first point, which I think you must now be all aware of, but I made this point already long before he became president, a second time, that if he were to become president again, this will be a very different presidency from the last one. And this is for the, very briefly, the following 5 reasons. First, he personally feels anointed. He feels anointed. He has survived the consequences of his failed attempted coup. He got away with it, though he would feel he didn't get away with anything because he always won. But that's not important. And of course, he, in addition, though I didn't stress it, he survived assassination attempts. He has the benefit of an absolutely loyal party in Congress, at least at the moment. We don't know for how long that will be true. And this, as I contrasted in one of my columns, which one I've been doing, is absolutely different from the comparable situation that Richard Nixon had in the early 70s, when he was judged by his party following Watergate and removed. Trump knows he has their loyalty. He has the benefit of an administration, quite unlike the last one, filled with devotees whose desire is to serve him alone. He has a fully worked out program, particularly domestic program, the so-called 2025 project. I hope you've all read it. If you've not, you'll find it, I would find it pretty disturbing, but it's a pretty worked out program. And he has a will to remake not so much the world as the US relationship with the world. This is quite a big deal, I think. Domestically, the best way I think you can think of what the Trump administration seeks to do is to dismantle what it calls the administrative state and to collapse that down to something very small. It's essentially the state that was created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, though it started, as Frank Fukuyama has emphasized in much of his writing earlier. The building up of an administrative state, a bureaucratic state in the US, goes back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But they really want to get rid of the autonomous, technocratic, independent bureaucratic system that the US, following earlier European examples, built up in that period. They are determined to erode, if not undermine completely, the division of power, assuming the law-making power through executive orders of the president, always there, but operating this to a quite extraordinary degree across many, many areas of policy. And without that, things like, to give you an example, the closure overnight of USAID, which is, I just give one of many examples, established in US law, would have not have been possible. And of course, if the courts decide that he has to reverse it, there's nothing to recreate. It's gone. And he's also operating to suppress the independence of the legal system from two sides: the legal industry itself, the law firms of the US, and of course the independence of the judicial arm of the executive, which is fully accepted in terms of the people who are now head of the Department of Justice and so forth, that the president's word is law. This is the complete internalization of the legal process within the White House. More important, and to my mind even more extraordinary, is there is a full-scale attack going on against fundamental Enlightenment principles in terms of commitment to science, reason, independent research, and expertise. And for that, you can look at the attacks on the universities, but I think even more significant, to my mind, the quite extraordinary attacks on America's health research institutions, which, of course, have been world-leading, and which I think prior to this administration would have been really unthinkable. And also, as a number of American commentators says, to replace these institutions with what they call a patrimonial state, which is, we in Europe would call a monarchy. Namely, and I don't mean a monarchy in the sense of kings and all the rest of it, but a system in which essentially the will of the head of state is law. And it's pretty obvious that if this project continues without check and continues into the future, the US, seen either as a republic or as a liberal democracy, which to me are synonyms, but I don't want to go into that, would disappear. And when I first wrote about this, which was in March 2016, to take the date, I did so under a column with the headline, "Donald Trump is how great republics meet their end." And I made the explicit comparison because of my intellectual background, with the fall of the Roman Republic at the end of the 1st century BC. So I think this is a very, very major moment. Since the US is the most successful republic since the Roman, arguably the most successful republic ever, I think this is a pretty big moment. So much from my view of the background here. Now, if you look at Trump's administration's role in the world and its view of its role in the world, and I think this is pretty well shared, they do not believe the fundamental role of the US is as a stabilizing hegemon, particularly one operating through and with powerful, independent, technocratic institutions. It doesn't see its role as, at its core, as creating and sustaining alliances either. It's clear from their views, notably in the trading system but elsewhere, there is an abandonment of the US commitment to the liberal world order more broadly. And finally, very clearly indeed, in a way that was mentioned by my co-panelists in the trade discussion, it's not just that he wants to go back to America's 19th century view of economic policy. He actually clearly has a nostalgia for the 19th century order of unbridled competing great powers and spheres of influence. There's no other way to comprehend the way he talked about and talks about Canada, for example. So these are very different visions. How far he will go with any of this, nobody knows. How coherent it is, nobody knows. We can see, but I think this is very much the frame of mind they have. Now, people might feel that this old version, the hegemonic United States of the post-war period, was a huge hypocrisy, and I sympathize with and understand it, but I also have always had the view that hypocrisy is the homage vice pays to virtue. And if a great power has no hypocrisy at all, it's simply a predator. Now, this is what I think the results of Trump true for the US and global economies are likely to include. Obviously, given its extraordinary fiscal policies, which I'll come to in a moment, no reduction in US external deficits. We all know that the US is operating at close to full employment. It has a fiscal deficit which will be at least 7% of GDP, and we know that that's the counterpart of the external deficit. That's what's financing it, and there's not the slightest chance the trade policy will work to reduce the deficit. And we know what it will do. It will substitute inefficient production in the US to the extent it does anything for efficient production in the US. So to use a technical term in economics, it's nuts. There will be, under this regime, a permanent increase in uncertainty, and it's not just in the United States, though we would like to limit it to the United States. And even in trade, this is very important. If the major market in the world system, and one of the two great powers, operates a policy, I'll just give this one example, of radical discrimination among all the countries in trade, every deal that it signs with every other power will affect all the others, but they won't be at the table. Now, of course, it doesn't matter if it's a deal with Lesotho. That won't matter. But there are lots of deals it can reach, obviously with the bigger powers, but even with middle powers, which, if it gives certain concessions to that country, will immediately undermine what countries competing with that country expect. So it's not just that what the US is doing in trade policy is, okay, we can ignore that. It's choosing among all its partners. And on what basis? What are you doing for me today? This is precisely what the global trade system, as created, and I've just focused on that, wanted to avoid. And it's really important. So I wrote a whole column just on the problem of managing trade diversion in this new system. And this is this problem. I think, I won't go into this detail, but it is obvious that there is a step rise, it's always been a degree of corruption, in US corruption, from the top my God, from the top. And inevitably, the US plays such a huge role. I remember this, there's some advantage of being around so long. The effort the US put into, through the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, I think that was what it was called, to stop American and other firms in the world from being corrupt. Of course, it didn't prevent corruption. Nothing can completely. But they really did try. That's gone. That will have a huge effect on, in my view, on the behavior of businesses across the world. And it's a big issue. And there will be a permanent step change in global economic and political instability. And I cannot believe, given what's been discussed today, of the state of the world economy, that that won't have the effect, to some degree, it's complicated, of permanently lowering global economic growth. I don't know by how much. There are other factors, but that's my view. It's difficult for me to believe this will all be costless. And I'm just repeating here what was said by Mr. Kwame. I hope I pronounced that right. I apologize if not. Oh, thank you very much. This is just taken from he mentioned it, I've just given the chart of it. These are from a chart I did, a column I did on the Global Economic Prospects paper, which is extremely good. And it just shows, just in the last few months, between January and June, the downgrade of forecast for growth just for 25 and 26. So 25 is blue, 2026 is red, and those are the comparisons, but to the left is shown how much they're downgraded. And you can see, of course, they're not colossal, but there are downgrades in growth for both years, not insignificant. These are aggregate growth, so GDP per head proportionally will look worse. And even for India, there are downgrades of not much short of half a percentage point. I'm not saying this is right, but these, I think, are a reasonable conclusion. And this chart, which this also comes from, that puts the context for this, which I think is very important and something that I think should be of concern of all, is what is happening to the rate at which we are getting rid of extreme poverty in the world. So these are successive decades, 1999, 2009, 2010, 2019, for emerging market and developing countries as a whole. Is the first one, the big blue block. Then the light blue block is AMDs excluding China and India. And then the last block is low-income countries. And the crucial point is 2000 and 2009 was a sensational decade, dominated by what happened earlier. It's been getting weaker since then. But between 2020 and 24, of course, partly because of the pandemic, the progress in lowering poverty has essentially stalled, and in low-income countries, it's going backwards. And that's, I don't know whether that's obviously partly significantly influenced by the pandemic, but this is not a picture we want to see continue. And there are lots of stress points, debt and so forth, affecting low-income countries. So this, if this is true and it's related in part to what Trump's doing, that will be serious. Now I want to go more narrowly just to talk about some of the economic consequences. I'm going to talk about deglobalization and what that might mean and put it in a broader context. Actually, Heiwei said some of these things. Then I'm going to focus a little bit on de-dollarisation. Is that possible? Then I'm going to stress here, I'm not going to come back here, that there are some very important areas in which cooperation globally is going to be much more difficult in this environment. The most obvious, which I don't think anybody's discussed, is the US has gone rogue on climate issues. I happen to think climate issues are rather important. It is the second largest emitter in the world. And basically, not only has climate become a subject you're not allowed to talk about, but they're closing down a great deal of the research facilities of the US, which have been so important in analyzing what's going on. The second area where I think I have at least big questions is, will we be able to sustain, despite the fact that the US is apparently staying in the World Bank and the IMF, sustain our efforts on development, particularly We're so close to eliminating extreme poverty from the planet. We really are, and I want that to continue. And then finally, there's a whole set of issues of security and security relationships, and I fear that a US driven by this sort of spheres of influence policy will not be very helpful in that regard. And then, of course, at the very worst, it's not an accident, in my view, that we're seeing all these wars break out. That's going to become a normal part of the world. Really intense regional wars, and possibly very much more than regional. So there are consequences of this sort of emergence of this sort of the US, which are potentially, in my view, important. But I'm now going to focus on the purely economics aspects. And here on globalization, I want to say something which is helpful and maybe in a way comforting. I think it's very important to understand that globalization, the process of integration among human societies over the planet, is a very long-run process, and it has many very different aspects. So there's globalization of goods, which is what we focused last time, services, capital, people, movement of people, movement of data, and movement of ideas. Now, I'm not going to go through all those. That would be a whole set of other lectures. But I think it is important to stress that though movement of goods is very important, tariffs only affect goods, and they won't eliminate trading goods. Globalization as a whole, these other features of our integration will not be killed. I think they are genuinely unkillable, and that's clearly true of many services, above all those services which integrate with movement of data. We are not going to stop the movement of people. Pretty clear that we're not, for all sorts of reasons, including the perfectly obvious one that many of the rich countries are hopelessly old and need workers. So that's going to happen. We just make a mess of it. And I would stress even more important, the thing that seems to me most important of all, I like to remind this, is the movement of ideas. So in some profound way, we will continue to globalize. One of my favorite tropes is we have this very passionate isolationist mood at the moment in the United States. We are very hostile to foreign ideas and all the rest of it. And I would like to remind them, where did they think Christianity came from? Now, let me move on to this specific issue, which is something that many, many people have been focusing on recently, which is the currency order. Are we at a point at which we could imagine that we're going to move away from the dollar? And the argument that that will happen comes out basically to three things. First, US is destroying trust in itself. And holding the currency of an issuer, whoever, it might be your own government, certainly of other governments, depends on trust in that issuer. And if you think the US will not behave in a way that makes its fiat currency creditworthy, well, that will be a good reason to cease holding it. The second reason, which is linked to that, is there are very specific and obvious abuses from the point of view of reserve holders of its power that come from issuing the currency and having the financial system through which it is used for all the things you want to use a currency. That gives the US immense power, and it uses it massively. And that's a perfectly good reason for countries to want to have less of it. And it's absolutely clear the Chinese are working very, very hard to do that. They don't want to be dependent on US power. But I would stress, and I've personally experienced this in discussions, abuses of US power through sanctions immensely irritated the Europeans on many occasions. Actually, one of the most interesting ones was when the US pulled out of the agreement on on the nuclear program of Iran in 2017. That really irritated them. So that's a second reason not to have anything to this. And then finally, going back to the falling trust, but it's a very concrete one. Well, the US, as Holger pointed out very close, Holger Meeting pointed out, well, the debt is going through the moon, and I'm going to say that. So there are very good reasons not to hold the dollar, and they're growing more important. But the difficulty is there is no obvious replacement. And I'm going to come to that in a moment. And I think the likelihood, rather than of replacement, is it will remain the world's most important currency. There is likely to be growing use of the euro if they don't mess that up. And in a different way, the renminbi, though the Chinese, in my view, and I've been arguing this for about 20 years, will not, under any conceivable circumstances, as long as this regime lasts, allow the renminbi to become a fully convertible, tradable currency, because of simple reason, these are control freaks, to put it bluntly, and having a currency which is owned by vast numbers of foreigners is not something that increases your control over your people. On the contrary, it gives them lots of exit opportunities, and you don't want that to happen, so they won't let it happen. And therefore, the renminbi can never be used as a fully convertible currency, and that makes it decidedly unattractive as a reserve currency, not only for governments, but also for private individuals around the world. So the Chinese can create and are creating a closed wall in settlement, and people will hold yuan renminbi to manage the settlement in those transactions with China and perhaps even with each other, but it will not become a major rival of the dollar, because for that you need a currency that is associated with a huge liquid market which is open to the world. Financial market which is open to the world. And even there, the euro has a number of big problems, of which the most important, and this is a footnote on what Holger says, the great advantage of the euro is that there are, how many members now? 27 members of the euro? No. 20, I thought it was 20. So 20 or 21. The advantage is that stops them from doing anything stupid, but it also stops them from doing something quite sensible if you want to get lots of people to hold your currency, which is have an integrated financial market. And so that's a permanent difference. So my view is the dollar will shrink, but unless something catastrophic happens, which I'll come to in a moment, it will remain the dominant currency. And like other parts of the system, the currency world is just going to fragment somewhere. I also think the fiat currencies will remain global. Now, this is a slightly misleading, well, it's more than slightly misleading, but in a way it shows something. So this is how trade finance works. It's one of the few areas where I've got pretty clear data. This is from the SWIFT payment system. The SWIFT payment system is obviously the Western system. So, but you can see that in this system, which is the system where you've got open financial markets operating on capitalist principles, the US dollar remains overwhelmingly the dominant vehicle currency for these transactions. And the euro and the renminbi remain very, very minor relative to that. There'll be a very big shift before people forgo the network benefits of this to move to others. This is the situation since 1999 in terms of the composition of global reserve assets, and the dollar is the blue at the bottom. The red is the euro, the pink at the top is the renminbi as a reserve asset, officially referred to by the IMF. The yen, the renminbi is trivial. Essentially, all the reserve assets in the world are those of the US and its allies. And unless there is a real shift, the only plausible rival is the euro. It's overwhelmingly probable that people can reduce their reserves, and in fact it's very interesting, I won't show a chart of that. In the last 10 years there has been no further accumulation of reserves as shown by the IMF in the world. There was a huge accumulation up to 2015 that stopped completely. I'll come to another aspect of it, but there is really, it will be very difficult to see how this could shift away from the dollar quickly. It's really, really hard. And then, of course, there's a reason people are ending up holding lots and lots of dollars. The US runs an absolutely spectacular external deficit, and that means if you're going to the world is going to finance it, and the world seems to be very happy to finance it up to now. I looked at all the surplus countries on the right. They end up with, one way or another, with dollar liabilities, equities or financial liabilities. And a very large part of that, significant part of that is, of course, US Treasuries, because it's the biggest borrower in the system. And I think about 35% of treasuries are held by foreigners. So it's rather difficult to escape that. To stop this accumulation, people would have to stop funding those deficits, and then we'd have a rather large financial crisis. And again, another way of seeing the same thing, the US is in the world system overwhelmingly the country with the largest net liability position. In fact, the net creditors are basically holding claims when you work through the system. At the end of it is a US borrower. And that includes, of course, these are also equity liabilities. But the US position in this financial system sort of guarantees that everybody else will hold colossal quantities of liquid US liabilities. But there is this problem with debt, and I think this is really quite a striking chart. This is US federal debt held by the public since it's the beginning of its history. And on the current forecast, without a war, anything significant, by the late 2030s, US debt indebtedness will exceed that at the end of the Second World War. And that, in peacetime, that is an extraordinary development, and we can say safely on the current fiscal trajectory that will continue. So we have this colossal set of claims, the rest of the world, directly, indirectly, on the US, much of it on the US government, and the US government is accumulating debt at an immense scale with a fiscal deficit of over 7% of GDP. And the one thing we can say with absolute confidence, at the end of the one big, beautiful act bill, as they call it, it's going to continue. Finally on this, which is not insignificant, there's been a very big upshift in real interest rates, which are now definitely positive. They're not very positive, but they are positive, and this shows from Treasury inflation-protected securities. So all that US government debt is not free. In conventional bonds, this gives you about 5% or so. So the idea that you could simply grow out of debt or inflate because debt is essentially costless is very definitely not the world in which they're now living. And perhaps one indicator that people are beginning to wonder about the dollar is what's happened to the price of gold. Look at the red line. The real price of gold has gone up to levels we've only seen before in 1980, in the last 55 years. So this is a system in which confidence remains in the US. There is enough to hold the system. There are no obvious compelling rivals, but there are lots of real weaknesses, fragilities. And that's the sort of system in which, in my view, you can get crises. How they will come, how quickly they will come, what will trigger them, but it seems to me that the core of the monetary order, the irreplaceable dollar, is unquestionably fragile. And that's quite an important point. So I will end with that. We've talked about trade, now I've talked about the monetary system, at least some aspects. Now, I'm now going to talk about, I said, is this permanent or temporary? It is the world's most important example, and I've mentioned that, of a broader phenomenon, populist authoritarianism in democracies. And as I discovered when I did my book, and I didn't know this before I did, that the underlying phenomenon was precisely identified in Plato's Republic, and he was writing, of course, about Athens, one of the earlier republics, well, the earliest in the Western tradition. And he said, and this we see too, it's driven by a blend of insecurity and grievance in the middle and lower middle classes, some of it related to globalization, a lot to quite different processes, directed simultaneously both up and down the social and economic scale. That is the constituency for anti-democratic populism across the world, not just in the US, though it's the most important case. We see it in Europe. In the US, this insecurity, in my view, written in my book, is driven by a blend of deindustrialization, inequality, racism, and fear of the rising superpower rival, China. And I think, this is why I stress this, that these forces will remain in the US public. Whatever happens to Trump, they're there. They're there in other countries too, and they won't go away. So I think some version of Trumpism is likely to endure, even if Trump cannot. And I don't at the moment see anything coming from the Democratic side that is not merely going to defeat it, but sort of defeat it so dramatically that it disappears and something else replaces it on the right. I think the sort of conservatism that we saw under Reagan, George W. Bush is gone. And that means Trumpism won't go. It's there. Moreover, even if Trump and Trumpist autocracy disappear, awareness of the fragility of the liberal order can't be forgotten. We've experienced things now which we had thought had gone. And what has been seen cannot be unseen, and what has been experienced cannot be unexperienced. We've seen how this system behaves, and we must always expect this will recur. So even if Trumpism itself were to prove temporary, the memory will linger. It can only fade away over what is likely to be a long time, and that long time would have to be one of peaceful, cooperative international relations in which the sort of issues I've talked about, the system, the currency system, the trading system, I haven't even talked about security issues, look pretty stable. Of course, the Trump revolution, though it's what I focused on because I think it's so important, is far from the only source of change in the world system. Also important are, and linked to it, intense superpower rivalries. That's obvious. Ongoing climate change with potential major changes in the climate system possible. And of course, though we've already had a wonderful discussion of it, technological change. And what I thought was absolutely marvelous in these discussions earlier on about the labor market is the proposition, which I find completely convincing, is that we will generate enormous numbers of jobs trying to prevent AI from destroying us. And it's obviously a very worthwhile jobs program. But I don't want to live in a world where that's one of our major concerns. And I thought quite a lot about AI and written quite a lot about it. And I really do think there are things that could happen with AI that could destroy a lot of our functioning of our societies. And now this is purely personal, but it's a personal vignette. We just discovered in the last couple of months a fake AI product, fake AI deepfake of me on Meta. I've written about this, in which I recommend fraudulent products to the customers. Of course, it was on Meta, as I said, and we know that this has been viewed by many, many, many millions of people, and it took us 2 months to get it down. So I feel absolutely there's a lot of ruin in this. So we're moving in all these respects into a new era. Now, I think this is the last chart, and I'm sure I've broken every time rule. We started a little later. So what is India going to have to do about all this? Well, I think the first and most important, I'm going to focus on the economics. I don't know what's going on here in this respect. I've talked to some ministers. But you first of all have to recognize the world is really fundamentally changing, and you need to work out what your policy system should be to deal with this. India has a very clear dominant economic interest to have an economic environment able to accommodate and support its continuing development. It's absolutely clear that's what it needs, and it shares that with other developing countries. One of the reasons for that, I'll show a very quick chart on this, is of course that India is indeed the fastest growing country in the major country in the world. But I think we can be more precise than this, and I've said this, I think, last year, I can't remember exactly, but I think it said, at the moment, the world economy is probably going to grow My guess is over the next 5 years, from what I read, about 2.5% a year, maybe a little bit more, not much. India wants to grow more than 6, probably 7 or 8, ideally, which is between double and 2.5 times the world. So that means that India needs a world economy that will remain open enough to allow it to trade successfully with most of the world's countries, while its exports, and obviously its imports, but its exports grow 2.5 times faster than the world. And that means, as you get bigger and bigger, that the world will have to be very open. So you have a very powerful interest in maintaining an open world system with a functioning capital system, all the rest of it. And I believe, and I've said this before, but I would underline it, that the best way India can do this is to play a significant role in strengthening and supporting the basic WTO rules and the principle of having rules in dealing with the trade of everybody else. And one way you can do this, which is a very specific suggestion, there are lots of others because I don't have my time, is that any concessions that India grants to the US in bilateral negotiations to the rest should also be extended to the rest of the world, with a possible exception of China, where negotiations can be had in line with the most favored nation principle. Not because it's giving us anything, because it is in your interest to make India seem a fair trading partner and not one that will give to the US more than it will give to anybody else because the US is a bully. So that is my suggestion on this. I've got lots more to say on this. I've already said, but I just put this chart up on India's relative economic performance. What is extraordinary, this is the average growth rate in successive decades with the IMF forecast for the countries of the world. India has been incredibly close to 6% of 6% growth of GDP on average since 1990. Would like to be higher. China has collapsed, as you can see, and no other country comes close. So India is the country more than any other in terms of its size already, and further it hopes was made, that needs an open world system. It really does. It's an important challenge to India. So my conclusion here is the US has become a revolutionary power, or as I think of it, as a counter-revolutionary power, or a permanent revolutionary power. Anyway, it isn't a status quo hegemon. This will create a great deal of instability, which is likely to be enduring for the reasons I've tried to suggest. The US is also a profligate power, obviously, in a world economy that seems to be incredibly happy to finance this profligacy, because there are so many surplus countries. But my guess is that won't go on forever. And what is puzzling about it is the US wants all this money from the rest of the world and hates the inevitable consequence, which is its current account deficit. Well, that's because they don't understand the difference between the left hand and their right hand. As a rising power, fourth point, India needs to preserve as much stability and reliability in the open global economic system as possible. I really don't think India can thrive as a closed economy with the sort of growth hopes it has. And in order to do so, it needs to play, in my view, an active role in stabilizing the liberal global economic system. There are many other areas it should play, but I think perhaps the most important point, India is a country, it's going to be the third largest economy in the world very soon. It plans to grow and should plan to grow much faster than the rest of the world. It needs to think of itself as a systemic power. And that's a big shift, but I do think over the next 5 to 10 years, it will become very urgent, and I would suggest sooner than that. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Martin. That was a real tour de force. I saw Swami's hand. Swami, you had a question?
Martin, most of your stuff, this entire lecture is presumed on Trumpism in the next 4 years having enough positive triumph to be worth persevering with. I mean, when you say that the thing is inevitable, etc., nothing is inevitable if the policy begins to look a failure. At this point of time, a large number of people would say that what Trump is attempting, he will fail to do. Because he fails to do, there will be a lot of disenchantment with everything that he is doing. The notion that there will be complete continuation, you seem to think forever, that Trumpism is going to continue forever. Why should it continue? First question is, why should it continue if Trumpism results in poor economic results? And knowing Mr. Trump, he will use executive power till his last day in office if possible. He will not act as a lame duck, as lots of others have been doing. And the second, briefly, is, among other things, you think that the erosion of the institutions will help this kind of Trumpism. Ultimately, the courts and the Supreme Court has always been the final arbiter to hold the president back. For a Supreme Court to agree to commit suicide so that the patrimonial state comes about, I do not think is likely. I do not think their justices will die in the dark. So it seems to me at the end of it all, Mr. Trump will want to do this. The others will want to do it, but just to preserve their own jobs and powers. I do not see the US judiciary just giving way and allowing a kind of autocratism to come about. I would like your views.
I think that's the fundamental issue, and obviously I can't discuss this at length in this lecture. So, the optimistic view, sorry, I apologize. So the optimistic view is this is a temporary blip. People will experience this, and the reaction will be effective and powerful. And when I discuss this with American friends, we sort of put odds on this. And of course there are disagreements on this. But I think that there are several questions here, because we're at a very, very early stage in this process. The question, in a sense, is whether what is effectively a coup within the system will go through. And if you look at I have a general view on this, which is that the effectiveness of the resistance depends on, not on the institutions but themselves, but the people who operate these institutions. I would say that of the institutions in effect, the courts have been so-so, mixed, very mixed, very mixed. The Supreme Court, not even mixed. I mean, it's hyper-cowardly, and it's made a whole slew of judgments which are simply unbelievable, of which the most striking was actually one when Donald Trump wasn't even in power, which was that it made him immune to criminal prosecution for any action he performs as a president. And if you want to read the philosophical and legal flaws with that judgment, I strongly recommend an article written by Jonathan Sumption, probably Britain's leading legal theorist, and since we have essentially the same legal system, he understands absolutely what he's about, making a devastating conversation, condemnation of the Supreme Court in that. And of course, the Supreme Court has continued. There are one or two exceptions, but it's continued to grant him extraordinary freedom to act. And this is partly because, I don't think this is fundamentally because they are frightened, though it is a factor in a lot of what is going on, because there is lots of fear, unquestionably. But more important, a lot of them align with his aims. There are not all the time, but enough. So it's not at all clear that the Supreme Court will overthrow him. Congress ditto. Now, the crucial question to my mind, the action that he just took in, I mean, so many in Los Angeles, they're all of very doubtful constitutionality. The crucial question, and that I agree, which is where I agree with you, is what will happen in the midterms and in the next elections. Will the US have fair elections or not? Now, we all know, let's be clear about, US elections are not what we would regard, at least in my country, as fair. Anyway, there's huge voter suppression and so forth. We don't know what the coercive power how the coercive power of the state will operate, I think it is perfectly plausible, and I'm just putting some of the fears, that the threat of military action, which we've just seen, on completely specious ground, completely. There was no national emergency that justified putting the US Army, the Marines, on the streets of Los Angeles. Do you think it's inconceivable that there will be Marines on the streets of every major American city in the next congressional election? And who's going to vote in those circumstances? I think you're being, let me be clear, I hope I'm wrong. You could well be right. You could well be right, and I hope desperately you will be right. But my fear that Trump and Trumpism would lead to this point, which I got in 2016 when I was regarded as a certifiable lunatic, it looks at least much less implausible than it did then, and the next 2 to 4 years will be decisive in the history of the Republic. But there is another point that I think is important. Let's suppose you're right. The American right is not going to go back, in my view, to the sort of liberal free market right, that constitute right that we wanted. And the American, so one, possibly the right fragments in a profound way, and the left clearly is on the way to fragmentation, in which case the political order will be around the difficulty of producing any political order. But I do think, so this is perhaps a better way of where we might converge, and probably not. I think America is going through the biggest political crisis since the Civil War, and we don't know, and nobody knows how it will end up. And for that reason, at least, we have to take seriously the phenomenon we are seeing. We have to pray that it will be overthrown. I do. Partly why I've been writing all this stuff, and my colleagues have been writing this stuff. Not that it has much influence, obviously, in certain parts of Texas. But I think you should take seriously that this is a constitutional order in huge crisis. And the history of constitutional orders over the centuries is they get into extreme crisis, and it's not going to be easy to go back to the America that we knew. That's all that. Beyond that, let's see. But at the very least, I think we should look at this and say, how did this happen? Because surely all of us 10 years ago, certainly I 10 years ago, would have regarded any of what I've just described, domestically and internationally, in the actions of the US as inconceivable. So we're already clearly in a territory none of us imagined. Now we hope this will all stop and go away and things will go back to normal. I'm not as confident of that as you. At the very least, we have to recognize what has happened.
Martin, why do you think there are no fiscal conservatives left in the world? What happened? What changed? Why did everybody become so short-term? And why is there no punishment? What happened to the bond vigilantes, or just the punishment?
Well, I think on the latter you're being a bit too critical. I think the bond vigilantes are beginning to wake up, which is why real interest rates are getting to not completely ridiculous levels, as it were. But my answer to, so let me focus on the developed world, because I'm not going to talk about what's going on in the developing world. We all share certain structural problems which explain why fiscal pressures on the spending side are very strong. That varies across countries, but essentially demographic change. On the whole, relatively slow productivity growth. The US has improved and is much better than ours, but it's not that fast, actually, by historical standards. The pressures from, certainly in the US, rising inequality have made spending pressures very great. And there are also some dysfunctional systems, like the US health system. So spending pressures are very, very strong. And in countries in which the real living standards of most people are rising very slowly, the willingness to accept higher taxes for them is very low. So it's getting somebody to impose taxes on the majority of the population, the bottom 50, 60%, doesn't really work. So if you're going to raise taxes, it's clear for me in Britain, in America, you're going to have to tax the most prosperous people more heavily. And they don't want to be taxed. And they have enormous amounts of political influence, and in the American political system, they have overwhelming influence. I'm sorry to say that, but if you want to see what a plutocracy looks like, look at the US now. Look at how the voting system works. So that's, as it were, the interests and the pressures. But in the US, I think there's a specific process, which is very, very interesting. But I see some signs of this in other countries. But this is the US dynamic, which is fascinating. So by and large, and you will find this perhaps different, but if you look at the last 40 years, the presidents that have reduced the fiscal deficit consciously and deliberately were Clinton and Obama. Just look at the numbers. And they did so because they were told by respectable economists like my friend Larry Summers, who was US Treasury Secretary, and Bob Rubin and equivalents under Clinton, and Obama, where it was Larry again, Tim Geithner, that's the responsible thing to do. It will lead to lower interest rates and all the rest of it. And they did it. And so after, in the 90s, the US eliminated its fiscal deficit. It ended up with no deficit. There was some accident, but it was a tremendous achievement. So it's not true that that's only 25 years ago. Yes. And actually under Obama, partly because of political pressure of the deficit was coming down. What followed in both cases under George W. and Trump 1, and Trump 2 is going to be worse, was a massive regressive tax cut. There were elements in it, by the way, the corporate tax reform that Trump did was, I think, completely sensible. I won't get into the, but essentially there was a massive regressive tax cut. So the Democrats said to themselves, and that's what you saw in the Biden administration, I won't go to all the other countries, they said to themselves, okay, we are fiscally disciplined, we raise taxes, we cut spending, we bring down the deficit, and what happens is the Republicans come along and give this enormous freebie to the rich, and who are not going to vote for us anyway and don't want to support us. This is a mug's game. There's no reward in the system for doing that, short of crisis, so why do it? And Biden said that, no, we're going to go in and we're going to have a huge tax cut. So that was when the system converged. So it's relatively recent in the US up to now. Now, this started with the great political genius Ronald Reagan, who basically, as Cheney, I think, was famously said, he proved that fiscal deficits don't matter. And I think that what is interesting about this story, and the same was true in important parts of our country, is that the right was the most irresponsible fiscally. And once the right is the most irresponsible fiscally because tax cuts will pay for themselves and all the rest of it, then the left gets fiscally irresponsible. So that, to my mind, is the dynamic that has happened. Strangely in our system, the left is more fiscally prudent than the right, partly because they think the markets are suspicious of them, which is true, and partly because they think actually it's the better way to run the economy, because they're more driven by technocratic economists who think like that. So basically now the consensus is nobody cuts the budget. So that gets to your big question. This can't go on forever, because what can't go on forever stops. Herb Stein's law, which I quoted this week. So at some point there's going to be a crisis on this part. That's for sure. And that's why the dollar story is so interesting. I haven't the faintest idea when it will be and how it will be, but the US is basically operating. The US fiscal system is essentially, this is terribly simplification, the counterpart of every major surplus in the world. That doesn't last forever because these things don't last forever. And then people will say, well, it was a very big mistake to ignore deficit because it will be a very, very big mess. But that's part of where we are. Now, when that big mess happens, then I suspect, no idea, all the politics here will change, but unfortunately we'll have to go through that mess. And that mess will include a period when people think essentially the US is an irresponsible borrower, and that will be very destabilizing.
One sec. Savanand and then Holger.
Thank you for this. So I was struck during your discussion about globalization that you think you're quite confident that the movement of people is going to continue. And the reason this sort of struck me was that, Trump may be obsessed with goods, but the Trump movement really cares much, much more about immigration as an issue, right? You have Stephen Miller in the White House.
Yep.
You sort of see the sentiment of pro-Trump intellectuals. And this is something that, that is mirrored in large parts of Europe. You see the rise of far-right parties. You see places like Denmark, which are trying to reverse the course of immigration. A huge issue, of course, I don't need to tell you, in the United Kingdom. So why are you more sanguine about the continued movement of people, when as a political issue, this is so much more salient for the right more broadly than goods?
So my answer to that is, I want to put this in the most nuanced possible way. There are going to be very significant efforts to slow it. And I think they will probably succeed. We've been there before. The period in world history, I'm sure you know this, the period in the last 250 years, we don't know about prior periods. I'm not going to talk about the movements of the Mongols and so forth. The period that had the highest migration relative to the human population was the late 19th century. And that then slowed. And a lot of that slowed, and that was migration essentially to the New World. And that slowed in response to domestic pressures, the Great Depression, precursor and so forth. But it never went to zero. And then after the Second World War, we started finding that Europe, which had always been an exporter of people, became an importer. So my expectation here is something like this. There will be a lot of pressure to slow it. It will slow. It will not be stopped, because we will find, for two reasons, that we just have to have them. And that's perhaps less true in America, but I think it's true there. One, there are a really large number of jobs we have to have done that we don't want to do, as it were. None of us want to do. We want people to come in and do them. We could not run our care home system for old people. I mean, we could not, at any price our government could afford, without tripling wages and paying the taxes, coming back to the earlier discussion, without immigrants. Second, and that's true for the whole of the continent, as far as I know, the Japanese seem to hope they will do it with robots. Well, that may be AI. I don't know. I'll leave that aside. And the same applies to looking after children. The second reason is if we're going to have productivity growth and all the rest of it, I think that links very well with our earlier discussion this morning. We need skilled people. And a lot of the world's skilled people come from other countries. So I can't imagine a situation in which most of I know Trump and so forth are trying to stop this now, when we are, in Britain, for instance, are not going to want more skilled immigrants from India. There's no objection to that. There's no resistance whatsoever in the British politic to import just with Indian doctors, scientists, technologists, so forth. No limits at all on this. So for these reasons, my expectation, yes, it will be contained, but it will not be stopped. Just as capital flows won't be stopped because the opportunities are so great, and people will not see an objection to that. You can't stop ideas, good ones and terrible ones. They float across frontiers. In the end, humanity is doomed to live side by side, and that will include actually living side by side in our countries. Now, I didn't want to make a forecast on this, and clearly some countries are going to be much more resistant to some aspect of this than others. The Japanese will have to work out a way of doing this which doesn't actually involve having any foreigners there, as far as I can see. But I think the countries that are basically adapted to this to some degree, I may be wrong, but I don't think zero net migration, and certainly zero gross migration, is feasible.
One second. It's Holger you were asking. Next woman, I'll take.
Martin, thank you for a great speech. I can subscribe to, say, 95% of it.
That's way over what I would have expected.
That's indeed a lot. Perhaps we have similar backgrounds. But two issues I would like to probe you on. First of all, I wouldn't worry that much about Trumpism. My real worry is the polarization of society. Trump may be a lame duck less than 18 months from now. My worry is that Trump may not be succeeded by J.D. Vance, but maybe succeeded by a junior version of Bernie Sanders. Or more precisely, that the next election could be between J.D. Vance and that.
Yeah.
And so that's the first point. It's less the Trumpism, it's the polarization, the erosion of the middle, the political middle.
Yeah.
And then is, what lesson will the American society draw from the financial crisis that is almost inevitably coming? Bond vigilantes, thank you for bringing it up. It takes a while to erode the dominant position of the US dollar, but there is no political will in the US whatsoever to do anything about the budget. So you know there will be a crisis, say, 5 to 7 years from now. And the key question for me, really for the global economic order, is how will the US public react when, say, dollar-euro 150, 10-year yield in the US 7%, the US Congress, somebody in the US is finally forced to hike taxes? Will the US public then say, back to the middle of the road because the extremes didn't work? Or will we go for something even worse than the current polarization?
Okay, I think that both are very, very good questions, and I've gone on far too long, and we should have dinner, shouldn't we?
Yeah, we'll stop.
So
Last two questions.
So I think so this question, and Swami asked this wonderful question, so it sort of goes from there. As you rightly say, part of the process, and I've discussed this at great length of politics, is the hollowing out of the middle. And I discussed that in my book. That's a very complicated set of issues. But as an observation, it's clearly correct. I think the middle is seen as unsuccessful when it ruled, generally hypocritical, and it's too identified in power terms with the sort of people who are in this room. Namely, the middle is technocrats, people who, the sort of, somebody once had this beautiful description of the hostility to this in the US, which I thought was wonderful. The middle are people who know what they think and take it for granted. They know what should be done, and they're all the smartest kid in the class. And we all agree that the smartest kid in the class we hate. I just thought that was wonderful. I'm sure everyone here was the smartest kid in the class. Well, there are some exceptions, but anyway. So the point is, in a complex society, in a really complicated society where we take for granted policy decisions are fairly complex, you need to know what you're doing, and we are the sort of people who run the bureaucracies and the systems that say all this and come up with rather unpalatable conclusions like, no, you can't have these vast tax cuts because you can't afford them. So there's a very powerful instinct to reject all that. And when the policies associated with that technocratic view blow up, and I think that's why the financial crisis was so significant, at least I've argued that, because it seemed to me indicate that these technocrats didn't know what they're doing, and the treatment of the pandemic obviously played into that, but I won't go into that further. You end up with most people saying, well, the experts who have run the whole system, the center, as it were, the nice liberal middle-class people, they don't know what they're doing. And we should go for somebody who sort of seems completely certain and will change everything. And I would quote an email I once got, but it's a sort of remark you say, we should support change because, quote unquote, things can't get any worse. And that's what they're voting for. Things can't get any worse. Well, that, of course, shows a severe lack of historical knowledge and lack of imagination. So that creates the polarization and the fantasy of transformative change. And we're going to have the same thing in all probably in America. Now, so that links then to the answer to your second question. Well, if this ends up in catastrophe, and these guys are in charge, the crazies, the only good possibility is that the society will learn from that they are crazy, and that they will go back to more sensible, sober people in the middle. But the other possibility is that that if the system fails again, as we've seen in the financial crisis, this will be another version of it, and they've lost trust in the center, and they've lost trust in the saviors that they've been supporting, they will lose trust in everything. And then you have a society which essentially fractures. And we've seen fractured societies. So I think one possibility, if you're right, is we are pulled back to the center and resolve, as it were, to fix this in a relatively sensible way. And the other possibility is the society fractures in such a way that functioning political leadership can't work in a democratic framework. And that is perfectly possible to imagine. So I do think personally, maybe I think people can legitimately accuse me of alarmism, and that's partly because my background is also in continental Europe in the interwar period, and I know what happened for precisely these sorts of reasons. But I'm not convinced that the crisis we both see coming will necessarily be salutary. But we do have to play, people like us do have to play the best role we can in pointing out the dangers and trying to induce people to think about it more sensibly. Will that be enough? I have no idea.
Okay, last question. This has been fantastic, but Suman, you had a question.
Well, I think Martin may already have answered this, but let me put it anyway. So you had talked of Agenda 2025 or whatever it's called, associated with the Heritage Foundation. And I assume that there was a coherence to that which was greater than the laundry list that you provided here. And so as it were, the abnegation of evidence-based policy and the institutions that support it, is that, as it were, a Trump add-on, or was that also part of that agenda? And this is more, specific to Trump rather than a remaking of the society. How do you interpret Operation Warp Speed and the delivery of a vaccine at the time of COVID under Trump 1, compared with, as it were, the actions of Kennedy as health secretary, etc.? How much has Trump himself changed in between these two?
This is a fascinating question. I interpret, and I'm not sure I'm right on this, but I believe I'm right, as Operation Warp Speed as one of the contributions of, it's a strange thing to say because I disagree with him on so much, but the only sensible person in the Trump White House, which was his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And he played a role in suggesting that, why not solve this thing by actually being the person who got the vaccines going? And do you know that Trump has since essentially disowned it? It's probably the most important contribution he made to the welfare of Americans, indeed the world. And because it's so desperately unpopular with his base, he has basically never claimed, well, he did very early, back in 2021, I think he still did, but he's basically disowned it, which is a very strange story. My memory of 2025, and I didn't read all of it, is that the war on science was not there. So there are several things that Trump has done in this term which look like whims of his and nobody foresaw, to my knowledge. And there are two I will stress. One, no one, I think, thought he was going to suggest that really it would be very, very nice if Canada became part of the United States. And certainly that this will be one of his first propositions. Nobody, I mean, that really came out of, I talked to a lot of, I'm not saying there wasn't, certainly wasn't part of the project. And Greenland, but he did have a little bit about Greenland. So that was a very real surprise. And the second one is exactly the one you mentioned. The people he's put in the intelligence services, the fact that a lot of them are Putin apologists, none of that was surprising, though that was not part of the project. The project was about the government, how the government, and they didn't suggest Doge either. So there are two, the Musk operation was a surprise. It was also a failure, but that was another matter. And the Canada thing was a surprise. The hostility to universities was not a surprise. That was very clearly shared across the system, particularly on the woke issues. But the hostility to scientific research, particularly medical research, and the appointment of RFK Jr. to be Secretary for Health, I think were, at least to the people I knew and know, a complete surprise. It didn't seem to come from anywhere. We knew there were elements in the base, particularly the right-wing think machine, that are contemptuous of the whole scientific endeavor. There are really important anti-Enlightenment figures in the background here, just as there are important, truly anti-democratic thinkers like Curtis Yerevan. But the fact that the Republicans would come into power and start implementing a radical anti-science, not just anti-university woke humanities department, was really a surprise. So my assumption has to be that has something to do with Trump, and people have got to Trump. But I'm not clear who those are. I don't know enough about American politics in detail to know where that came from. But it makes the movement look more wildly irrational and coming from forces more wildly irrational than I thought it would. I thought it would be authoritarian. I thought the other things, trade policy, would all. But again, the same point, by the way, I thought the trade policy would be enormously protectionist. That was clear. But that they would introduce the Liberation Day tariffs with a separate tariff for every country in the world on the basis of the reciprocal of the trade deficit. But nobody suggested this would happen. So there is an element in what's going on here which is sheer rank craziness, which doesn't make, next to some of this, Mussolini was a genius. I'm sorry, but yes, there are some immensely surprising things, but they move in the direction, and this is something very significant. It's profoundly irrational in the sense that not any American, one would expect, would have thought. But the base, it seems to be, by the way, this comes back to Swami's point. I don't know how this will end, but if you look at the polls, the base seems to be as devoted to Trump right now as ever. So there's something going on here which is quasi-religious, attached to a savior figure, and deeply unpersuaded by the whole fabric of rational thinking, of which we thought the US was the lodestar, the exemplar in the world. So there are things going on here which absolutely clearly are way beyond my worst imaginings.
Well, Martin, thank you so much. Really, I think everybody has had an extraordinary... Martin is going to be 80 years old in a few months. And if at 80, we all wish to have his mind and his energy and his efforts. Thank you, Martin.
Pleasure.